So here's the bigger idea about the research trajectory that led to the publication of this book, just to give you a sense of where we're coming from. The first thought was that over the last year or so, there's been a huge amount of research into the neurochemistry of romantic attachment. What's going on in our brains when we fall in and out of love, when we form attachments, when we break attachments, and so forth. And my co-author, Julian Savulescu, and a colleague of ours, Anders Sandberg, wrote a paper about 10 years ago where they suggested maybe we're at the point where we can go beyond merely describing the neurochemistry of romantic love to potentially intervening in that neurochemistry with biotechnology. And so they said, what happens if we move from the descriptive plane to a plane of technological manipulation of these systems, creating real life love drugs in some sense or another? And then that immediately raises a ton of ethical questions. And so a big focus of our work is the normative dimensions of this. Now that we have this technology available, we presume it will become more powerful in the future. Do we want to live in a society where we are able to exercise a certain measure of control over what's often seen as a very personal and meaningful part of the human experience? Is that the sort of thing we want to be able to intervene in, or should we resist this as much as possible? So in our early papers, we focused on very narrow cases. We tried to identify, could you imagine a couple where it might be appropriate to use these drugs? So we were sort of doing the romantic version of trolley problems, coming up with very finely tuned cases to test our intuitions against them. But some critics rightly raised the point that we should be thinking really about the wider implications of living in a society where love drugs or anti-love drugs exist. And a big worry here, and this is what I'll talk about for the next few minutes and then open it up for questions, is the concern that this would medicalize our romantic relationships, that love would be brought into the sphere of medicine. This has been very well described by the sociologist John Evans, so I'll just read his quote here. He says, "Many people have reached the normative conclusion that they do not want to live in a world where increasing swaths of human experience are under the logic of medicine. There are, or should be, experiences that use an older logic, which are under the jurisdiction of another profession or under no jurisdiction at all." And the example he uses to illustrate this notion is the medicalization of love. This is a final frontier, a line that just should not be crossed, according to Evans. We can all fear the medicalization of love. In our research, we've tried to break this down and get a little bit more precise about what the worry is. It sounds intuitive that we should fear medicalization of love, but what exactly is it that we should fear? One thing that you find is that there are consistent themes in the literature about medicalization, and they apply to love too. So one concern is that in order to give somebody a drug that you think may help them, the current paradigm is that we have to call the drug medicine. And medicine conceptually is linked to the treatment of some kind of disease or pathology. And so under current norms, what we do is if we have a chemical that we think will help someone, we call it medicine, and then we have to come up with, if there isn't one already, some pathology label that we can apply to the person to explain why it's appropriate for us to give them the drug. We discuss in the book is the need to open up to a different category of drugs, which we call enhancement drugs. And these drugs don't require first diagnosing somebody with a pathology. All that's relevant to the use of this drug, apart from resource limitation concerns, is this drug expected, all things considered, to genuinely improve the well-being of the person to whom they're administered? And if that's true, then we think that there's moral reason to make the drug available, again, taking into consideration issues of justice and available resources. A further concern about medicalization is the idea that this will just expand the control of medicine over our lives. And this is giving one more domain in which drug companies that are hungry for profit will find to eke dollars out of our joys and sorrows. And that's a very serious concern. I have a whole chapter discussing that. Maybe we'll come to that question too, which is that when you have a biotechnology available, you tend to then look at the world through the lens of what that technology can affect. And so in the case of drugs that affect the brain, you might now think of problems in relationships as having to do with failures in the individual rather than failures in the society, for example. Or you're going to focus just on the biological aspect of the problem instead of thinking about the reasons and the psychology that are involved. So those are going to be the focus. A final one that I'll just mention here is, and I assume we will want to come back to this, is the concern that any kind of love you might feel that's been, at least in part, elicited by the use of a drug might not be authentic. The thought is, well, it's really the drug that's causing me to feel like I love my partner, let's say, rather than really feeling it from my own resources. And that's something that we again discuss at great length in the book. We don't think that that's a necessary outcome of using some of these drugs, but again, we can come back to that. So what's the worry here? Peter Conrad has expressed the concern about the narrow focus on individuals in biology very eloquently. He says, medicalization can obscure the social forces that influence well-being. For example, by focusing completely on the neurobiological features of some condition, it might be seen as a genetic or a biological problem, and so treated predominantly with drugs. And then Barbara Wooten, in a classic piece, very succinctly says a powerful reminder of how easy it is to frame problems in terms of the narrow dimensions. In this very memorable phrase, she says, "Always it is easier to put up a clinic than to pull down a slum." And so this suggests that not only does it focus our attention on the narrow aspects of the problem, but it might actually disincentivize our looking at the broader structural issues that might be contributing to the problem in the first place. Here's a story from Jonah Lehrer that further illustrates this idea. And I'll just take a sip of water real quick. So he tells the story of a doctor, a psychiatrist, who was eager to help his patients, but failed to distinguish between suffering that was rooted in his patients' dysfunctional bodies and suffering that was rooted in their minds or their social contexts. And so he prescribed some medication to a woman for depression, as it happens. So this is SSRIs, the same drug we were talking about before. He says, "How is your medication working out?" She says, "It's working great. I feel so much better. But I'm still married to the same alcoholic son of a bitch. It's just that now he's tolerable." And the lesson here is that maybe she ought to leave the relationship rather than take a drug that makes it sufferable, so that she's willing to stay within it, even though you might think the underlying structure of the relationship, some deep problem really exists here, and she should rather leave it. In fact, one of the cases that we used to illustrate the permissibility of what we call anti-love drugs was the case of an abusive relationship. Our thinking was something like this. Imagine that somebody is in a relationship that objectively ought to end. So that's why we chose this extreme example. We figured pretty much everybody would agree that if you're in a relationship that involves physical violence or other kinds of emotional abuse, let's say, there's very good reason to think that the relationship itself is disvaluable and dangerous and should end. But what often happens in these kinds of situations is that a person who is the victim of abuse will grow ever more attached to their partner. And so it might be that they rationally know they should get out of the relationship, but everything in their emotions is making them feel even more drawn toward and more obsessively attached to that person. So you can, there a pill that you could take that would sever that first order emotional attachment so that you could now exit the relationship in line with your own higher level values. That seemed to be the sort of case where it might be permissible. But now you have a problem here, which is that maybe you're tackling the narrow aspect of the problem rather than looking at the bigger issues. So our colleagues wrote a paper responding to our earlier work in this area, and they said, well, the first and most obviously justified intervention in this case is not to drug the woman into unfeeling, but to alert the authorities to the violence and to refer her to supportive social and legal services. And that seems exactly right. Laura Purdy has also commented on these kinds of cases, the tension between structural and individual level solutions. And in an earlier paper in bioethics, she says, well, these kinds of points imply that women's or anyone's health will often be better protected by political action than by medicalization. But she asks, does it follow that women's health or anyone's health should therefore be excluded from the medical realm? Surely not. Because even in the best of circumstances, people will require all the help that medicine can offer. Such help needs to be made available to them. So it's an obvious point, but as another colleague of ours, Christina Gupta, writes, it isn't either or. It isn't just individual or social structural solutions. Rather, the individual and the structural, or the biological and the social, can work together. They're co-constitutive. And so interventions aimed at the individual may be effective at the broader social level, and vice versa. Julian and I wanted to come up with an ethical framework for when we think that drugs that could diminish or impair a loving connection should, what are some boundary conditions for when they should not be used? Because they seem like the sort of thing that would be easy to abuse, to use in a coercive manner. So just to pick the best case scenario for their use, we thought that they should target feelings that are clearly undesirable, both objectively and from the perspective of the person experiencing them. So the person admits, yes, these are feelings that I shouldn't have or that are bad for me to have. Another example is people who have exclusive sexual attraction to young children, for example. Pedophilic desires seem like the sort of desires that both from an objective and from the perspective of the person, they might say, it would be better if I didn't have these desires. The person would then want to use the biotechnology, reasonably believing that it would help them achieve their higher order goals, and their use would be voluntary and done under conditions of informed consent. And then as a final, very strict criterion, we suggested that it might be the case that these drugs should be used as a last resort. So a person can't overcome the undesirable or disvaluable feelings without the help of biotechnology, or reasonably judge that it would be not worthwhile given the alternatives. So to summarize, one ethical gesture we make in the book is to again quote Christina Gupta here. I would simply encourage scholars considering the ethics of biotechnologies to address problems that have both an individual and social component, to look at how you might integrate those interventions in order to achieve change. Eric Perrins writes, a blanket condemnation of medicalization would fail to acknowledge the respects in which women and men use medical technologies to gain control over their lives, to promote their flourishing. And in a paper of ours where we borrowed the quote from John Evans earlier, we said, by anticipating some of the specific ways in which these technologies could yield potentially unwanted outcomes, bioethicists and others can help to direct the course of love's medicalization, should it happen to occur, more toward the good side than the bad. And that's basically why we want to open up this conversation. The book, it's fairly long. We've got a whole bunch of examples, case studies, science. We get into the philosophy. We talk about love and so forth. But the broader point of the book is to open up the conversation, because as we stress, drugs are a day that can have profound effect for the most part. And we think it's important that not just Julian and I are sitting here thinking, what do we think the ethical constraints should be on these drugs? When should they be made available and to whom? But really the whole society needs to be getting in on this conversation. So I encourage you to check out, begin thinking about these issues, and then, writing op-eds or contributing to the academic literature or whatever it might be. So I'll keep it short. That's what I'll say in terms of PowerPoint slides. And now I'll just pull up the chat box here to see what kinds of questions people have.